Before the city could comprehend what was happening, red and blue lights had already taken over the narrow street in Atlanta, reflecting in the ancient windows as if announcing the end of a peace that, in truth, never truly existed. The sound of sirens echoed like metallic screams, piercing the sultry dawn, while neighbors gathered on the sidewalks in silence, mesmerized by a scene that seemed more like a living nightmare than a real event. At the end of the street, a house abandoned for years, shrouded in dry ivy and forgotten memories, was now invaded by armed police officers, tense paramedics, and muffled screams leaking through the cracks in the windows, as if time itself were trying to warn that something inside should never have been touched. Amid the sound of hurried footsteps, doors creaking open with a funereal sound and shocked looks, one image froze the moment. A thin girl, her face pale and dirty, was being carried in the arms of one of the officers, dressed in rags, her eyes wide with pure terror, as if still trapped in something no one else could see. The name whispered among the crowd was enough to cut the air like a blade. Emily Parker, missing for weeks, alive, but deeply scarred. Reporters jostled to capture the moment, while the entire city watched in stunned, a seemingly impossible outcome. And in the midst of it all, standing like a statue among the onlookers, he stood, Deshawn Lewis. No tears, no smile, just a look in his eyes filled with something no one could decipher, as if he knew a truth the world wasn't yet ready to hear. If you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps us continue revealing stories that have never been forgotten. Before that night of sirens, screams, and television cameras, Deshawn Lewis was just an ordinary boy trying to survive amidst the hardships of his neighborhood. He lived in a small wooden house on the outskirts of Atlanta, along with his mother, Angela, a tireless woman who worked 2 jobs to support her son and keep a roof over their heads. He barely knew his father. He had left when Deshawn was still a baby, leaving only a faded photograph and a void the boy could never fill. Angela did her best to convey affection, but long workdays at the hospital and a local diner often left her exhausted. So Deshawn spent most of his time alone, divided between schoolwork, small drawings in his worn notebook, and walks through the quiet neighborhood streets. His solitude, however, was not born of despair, but of observation. He was an attentive boy, the kind who noticed everything, even the most trivial details that escaped the notice of adults. At school, his quiet demeanor made him a target of teasing. Classmates mocked his shyness, the fact that he preferred to sit in the back of the classroom, doodling imaginary scenarios rather than participate in the noisy recess conversations. Sometimes, even teachers mistook his introspection for disinterest, ignoring the quiet depths hidden behind those curious eyes. Deshawn, however, didn't rebel. He had learned to endure the scornful looks and laughter of others with a kind of painful patience, guarding his words like someone protecting a valuable secret. What no one knew was that his mind worked tirelessly. While he appeared to be merely doodling drawings, he was actually deciphering the world around him, cataloging expressions, movements, and sounds, as if piecing together an invisible puzzle that only he could see. This sensitivity, often mistaken for fragility, was precisely the strength that would later change everyone's destiny. Angela, despite her exhaustion, noticed her son's loneliness and tried to compensate with small gestures. A simple dinner, hastily prepared, a kiss on the forehead before leaving for the late shift, or the effort to listen to one of his made-up stories, even when her mind was overloaded with worries. She knew Deshawn had something special, but she worried the world wouldn't recognize it. One afternoon, after another day of school silence and sidelong glances, Deshawn walked home. The summer sun sank slowly toward the horizon, tinting the sky orange and casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. He clutched his worn backpack tightly, and inside it his inseparable notebook. It was in this small object that he recorded everything: sketches of trees, the shapes of clouds, phrases he overheard, and even premonitions he couldn't explain. As he passed the corner where the old abandoned house stood, he paused for a moment. The wind blew hard, making the broken windows rattle lightly against the peeling walls. Deshawn stared at the building with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. To his neighbors, the place was nothing more than a forgotten skeleton, inhabited by rats and dust. To him, there was something strange there, something that seemed to breathe in the silence of the walls, even though no one was inside. Deshawn didn't know it, but that watchful gaze, that pause before the ruined house, would be the first sign that his fate was about to become entwined with a dark mystery. His dark eyes took in every detail: the slightly shifted back door, the absence of a lock, the echo of a distant sound that seemed to come from deep within. And it was exactly at that moment, as he started back home with his heart racing, that a feeling came over him. The impression that someone, somewhere inside that house, was desperately trying to be heard. For the next few days, Deshawn's routine seemed to remain the same. Waking up early, facing classes in the same silence as always, and returning home carrying the scribbles in his notebook. But inside, something had changed. Ever since he stopped in front of the abandoned house, a nagging premonition had been haunting him. He felt as if he'd been chosen to notice what everyone else preferred to ignore. The next afternoon, as he crossed the same street, Deshawn heard a sound again that chilled his blood. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, a muffled scream like someone calling for help. He stopped suddenly, his heart racing, and looked around to see if anyone else had heard it. But the sidewalks were empty, and the few neighbors present went about their daily lives as if nothing had happened. Deshawn moved a little closer to the house. The rusty iron gate swayed in the wind, emitting a high-pitched sound that mingled with the oppressive silence of the place. He held his breath, trying to discern if what he heard was just his imagination or something real. Then it came again, a low, almost choked moan, echoing from the dark interior. Startled, he took a few steps back, his eyes fixed on the broken windows and the torn curtains that swayed slightly, as if someone had just passed by. For a moment he felt watched. He turned quickly, but there was no one behind him. The chill in his spine grew, and instinct told him something was hidden within those walls. That night, the sound stuck in his head. While his mother slept exhausted after another shift at the hospital, Deshawn sat on the bed, holding the notebook in his lap. He scribbled the shape of the house, the windows, and the gate, as if trying to capture the nagging feeling that haunted him. With each stroke, he remembered the muffled scream and wondered if someone was trapped inside, invisible to everyone but him. The truth is, Deshawn didn't want to believe it was real. He preferred to think his creative mind had played a trick. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just imagination. There was urgency in that sound, and ignoring it would be like turning a blind eye to a life that depended on help. And it was in this mixture of fear and curiosity that the first spark of courage that would change his life emerged. The decision to return to that house and discover if his ears were really deceiving him. The next afternoon, Deshawn couldn't help himself. His steps, almost automatic, led him to the old, abandoned house, as if something larger was pushing him deeper into its mystery. The iron gate creaked as it was pushed open, revealing a garden overrun with tall weeds and scattered debris. The silence was so thick that even the birdsong seemed to elude him. He took a deep breath, rested his hand on his backpack, and pushed the back door open, which gave way surprisingly easily. The air inside the house was heavy with mold and accumulated dust, as if no one had been in the space for years. But the details told a different story. Fresh scratch marks marred the wooden floor, as if someone had tried to drag themselves away. The dust, which should have been uniform, revealed recent footprints, shattering the illusion of abandonment. Advancing cautiously, he illuminated the hallway with the dim, late afternoon light streaming through the broken windows. It was then that his eyes fell upon something unexpected. A flashlight lying on the floor, still lit, its beam flickering dimly as if it had been hastily dropped. Deshawn bent down and picked it up with trembling hands. The flashlight was warm, a sign of recent use. It didn't make sense. Who would have left it there? His heart was pounding, and the feeling of being watched grew with every step. The creak of a door in the distance made his body freeze. He took a deep breath, trying to convince himself it was just the wind. However, his instincts screamed that there was someone else inside. He moved forward, guided by his flashlight and fear mixed with determination. In the corner of one of the rooms, he found pieces of torn rope and fresh food wrappers, as if someone had been hiding there for the past few days. The weight of reality was beginning to sink in. This house wasn't empty, it was being used. For a moment, Deshawn considered running away, forgetting everything, pretending he'd never entered. But then he remembered the sound he'd heard over and over again, that muffled scream that haunted him in his dreams, seeming to be crying out for help. And if what he'd already seen was real, what else could be hidden inside? That question echoed in his mind when, as he approached the basement door, he heard something that made him freeze in place. A metallic sound, like chains being dragged in the dark. Deshawn ran out of the house, his heart hammering in his chest. With every step, the image of the lit lantern, the abandoned ropes, and the metallic sound echoing in the basement replayed in his mind as if it were impossible to shake. When he reached the main street, nearly stumbling with nervousness, he spotted a police car parked near a neighborhood grocery store. He gathered his courage, ran to the officer, and began to tell him everything he had seen. His words came out quickly, rushed by with the urgency of someone who knows he cannot be ignored. The officer, a tall man with a tired expression, listened in silence for a few seconds before letting out a heavy sigh. With a half-smile of disbelief, he replied, "Boy, this house has been empty for decades. You must have let your imagination run wild." Deshawn persisted, describing the scratches on the floor, the lit flashlight, the food scraps. But the officer just shook his head, shrugging as if he had no time to waste on children's stories. The boy felt his throat burn, as if his words were hitting an invisible wall. At home, he sought his mother's understanding. He waited for Angela to arrive, exhausted from her shift at the hospital, and even though he knew she barely had the strength to listen, he poured out the entire story, every detail of what he had witnessed. Angela, her eyes heavy and her apron still tied, held her son's face tenderly and said, "Deshawn, I know you have a vivid imagination, but don't put yourself in danger by going into abandoned houses. Promise me you won't do it again." The boy wanted to scream, wanted to shake the world so that someone would believe him. But instead, he just lowered his eyes and nodded, swallowing his frustration like so many other times in his life. At school, when he made a comment about what he had seen, his classmates laughed. They called him a ghost hunter, mocked his seriousness, and further isolated him. Each laugh echoed as a cruel reminder that his voice was worthless. Still, something inside him refused to accept the silence. The sounds he'd heard in that house weren't his invention. The warm flashlight in his hands wasn't a figment of his imagination. If no one believed him, there was only one way out: to discover the truth himself. And it was exactly in that moment of solitude and revolt that the decision that would change everything was born. Deshawn would go back to that house, even if it was alone. That night seemed quieter than all the others. The kitchen clock struck almost 11 when Deshawn, lying in bed, opened his eyes and realized he wouldn't be able to sleep. The echo of the screams he'd heard, the metallic creak of the chains in the basement, and the indifferent expressions of the people who ignored him swirled inside his mind. He knew he couldn't stay still any longer. If no one would believe him, he would have to act on his own. He got up slowly, so as not to wake his mother, who was fast asleep after another shift at the hospital. He grabbed his flashlight, stuffed his notebook into his backpack, and slipped outside, feeling the warm, dense Atlanta night air. The path to the old house seemed darker under the dim streetlights, but the boy walked steadily, as if each shadow were just an obstacle to be overcome. Upon arriving, he pushed open the rusty gate carefully, avoiding the clang of metal that might attract attention. The house, under the moonlight, seemed even more menacing, its broken glass reflecting shards of light like watchful eyes. Deshawn took a deep breath, turned on the flashlight, and entered through the back door. The silence inside was almost suffocating. Each step made the floorboards creak and dust rose in slow clouds, dancing in the beam of light. He opened his notebook and, with steady hands, began to sketch a quick map of the rooms. He noted every noise, every detail, as if recording a secret no one else cared to see. Upstairs, wind blew through the cracks, making doors slam softly. Deshawn held his breath, straining to hear beyond the sound of his own flashlight scraping against his hand. Then it came, a distant, muffled sob, barely audible, but repeated twice. The sound was clearly coming from the basement. He headed toward the stairs leading down. The railing was covered in dust, but along the middle were fresh marks, as if desperate hands had been bracing themselves against it. Deshawn shone his light on the steps and began descending, his heart pounding in his chest. With each step, the air grew heavier, thick with mold and damp. The flashlight beam trembled in his hand, not from the weight of the object, but from the growing fear clinging to his skin. In the basement, the boy found scattered objects that betrayed a recent presence, food scraps in plastic bags, a half-empty water bottle, and a dirty blanket thrown in a corner. But that wasn't all. Against the wall, padlocked chains hung loose, as if someone had struggled to free themselves. He swallowed hard and wrote hurriedly in his notebook, "Someone is, or was here." The sound of a mouse crossing the space made his heart race, but it was another, deeper sound that froze his movements. Slow footsteps upstairs. Someone had entered. Deshawn immediately turned off the flashlight and hid behind a stack of boxes, struggling to control his breathing. The sound of footsteps approached the stairs, creaking, slow, steady. Each step seemed to echo inside the boy's chest, like a countdown to something inevitable. He knew he couldn't stay there for long. If he were discovered, there would be no escape. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hands clutched the notebook. To his chest, like a shield, the footsteps suddenly stopped, and absolute silence fell over the basement. It was impossible to tell if the person had returned upstairs or was standing still, watching, waiting for the right moment to act. And it was at that very moment, when the darkness and silence became almost unbearable, that Deshawn heard something that would completely change his understanding of it. A weak, almost muffled voice, whispering between sobs. The voice was fragile, almost swallowed by the weight of silence, but it carried a pain impossible to ignore. Deshawn remained still, attentive, trying to identify the source of the whisper. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks, but as he brought the flashlight closer to the damp wall, he noticed a detail that sent goosebumps down his spine. Behind a stack of old boxes was a dusty pink school bag, embroidered in faded letters with the name, Emily Parker. Her heart raced. Emily wasn't just a name written on a forgotten object. She was the girl the whole neighborhood was looking for, the same one who appeared on posters plastered on lampposts and in store windows with the caption in red letters, "Missing." And now the proof was there, before his eyes. Deshawn knelt down, opened his backpack with trembling hands, and found scratched notebooks, an empty water bottle, and a broken toy. None of it seemed to have been left to chance. With each object revealed, the boy felt as if he were piecing together a macabre puzzle, each piece pointing to a single conclusion. This house wasn't just a forgotten shelter, it was a place of captivity. As he examined the objects, he heard the same voice again, this time a little clearer. It was a muffled call for help, coming from behind a false wall covered with wooden planks. Deshawn approached slowly, put his ear to it, and felt his heart race even more as he heard sobbing and the unmistakable sound of chains clanking. He quickly wrote down in his notebook, "Emily is here, I'm not alone." A chill ran down his spine. What had been merely a suspicion had become absolute certainty. This was neither imagination nor shadows. This house hid much greater secrets, and he alone was about to expose them. But even as the truth dawned on him, the weight of the threat also grew. For if Emily was there, someone had imprisoned her and kept her, and that someone might be much closer than he imagined. It was at that moment, while her fingers were still sliding over her backpack and her ears were still picking up every sob from the other side of the wall, that a new sound broke the silence, the sharp click of the front door being closed. The door's creak echoed through the house like thunder in the suffocating silence. Deshawn froze, his entire body trembling. With each passing second, heavy footsteps advanced across the upstairs floor, slow and measured, as if the returning guest were in no hurry, but carried the confidence of someone who knew every corner of that dark place. The boy turned off the flashlight, holding his breath. His heart seemed to pound too loudly, almost betraying his presence. He huddled behind the boxes, trying to become invisible, as the creaking of the floorboards approached the stairs leading to the basement. The sound of heavy boots descending the steps turned his fear into despair. Each step seemed to carry the weight of an indescribable threat. Deshawn felt cold sweat drip down his forehead and stick his shirt to his body. Emily's muffled voice from the other side of the wall suddenly stopped, as if she too had recognized the approaching danger. The silence was now absolute, broken only by the creaking of the stairs. When the shadowy figure finally reached the basement, the dim light of a brighter flashlight illuminated the space, sweeping over the boxes and into the dark corners. Deshawn crouched even lower, trying not to be seen, watching, heart pounding, as the shadow of a tall man loomed. Against the damp walls, he muttered incomprehensible words, muttering irritably, like someone who couldn't stand the clutter of his own secrets. The flashlight beam nearly reached him, passing inches from his hidden face. Deshawn bit his lip, forcing himself not to make a sound. He knew that if he were discovered there would be no escape. The man walked over to the false wall, touched the boards, and for a moment, Deshawn thought he would open it and reveal Emily before his eyes. But instead, the kidnapper simply pushed a box against the wall, as if to reinforce the illusion of abandonment. Minutes that felt like hours passed, until the footsteps finally began ascending the stairs again. With each step, the boy felt hope return, though mingled with dread. When the sound of the door closing upstairs, he took a deep breath, nearly collapsing with relief. But this respite was only temporary. For if the kidnapper had returned, it meant he wouldn't be long before he returned. Again, and before that happened, Deshawn needed to find a way to reveal the truth to the world. Deshawn ran out of the house on shaky legs, but with a firm resolve not to let this remain a secret. The night air seemed heavier, as if the neighborhood itself knew a terrible mystery had been unearthed. He clutched his backpack tightly. Emily Parker, that proof that no one could deny, and ran towards the nearest police station, determined to be heard this time. When he entered, panting, barely able to speak, the officers looked at him suspiciously. Some chuckled quietly, as if it were just another one of a curious boy's made-up stories. But when he placed the backpack on the table, the atmosphere changed. The name embroidered in worn letters, the broken toy, and the damp smell permeating the fabric immediately silenced everyone. One of the most experienced detectives, accustomed to handling disappearances, held the object and recognized it immediately. It was indeed the missing girl's backpack. Within seconds, radios began to blare, patrol cars were activated, and a flurry of activity filled the police station. The disbelief that had surrounded Deshawn until that moment vanished in the face of this irrefutable evidence. Minutes later, police cars raced through the streets, crashing through traffic lights and waking the neighborhood with their shrill sirens. Neighbors, who had previously ignored the boys' whispers, came out of their doors and windows, watching in amazement as the police procession headed toward that forgotten house. The journalists' cameras, always eager for shocking stories, soon arrived, capturing live footage of the operation that brought the city to a standstill. The invasion was swift and brutal. Doors were broken down, police descended into the basement, shouts of command echoed off the walls, and then, amid the chaos of flashlights and voices, an image that would never be forgotten. Emily Parker, frail, dirty and frightened, being pulled alive from behind the false wall where she was trapped. The neighborhood erupted in murmurs of disbelief. Some wept, others applauded, and everyone understood in that instant that the boy no one believed in had changed that child's destiny. As the crowd gathered in front of the house, Deshawn's gaze was lost in the red and blue lights dancing in the sky. There was a weight on his shoulders, not only of relief, but also of the knowledge that the dark secret didn't end there. Because if Emily had been found, the question remained, echoing silently, was she the only victim? The night in Atlanta was torn apart by lights coming from all directions, as if the sky itself had decided to illuminate the horror lurking behind the walls of the abandoned house. Helicopters circled overhead, their engines roaring with a metallic hum that seemed to reverberate within the bones of all who watched, casting powerful beams of light that pierced the darkness and transformed every corner of the property into a stage of tension and anticipation. Police cars blocked the surrounding streets, their sirens flashing frantically while the crowd gathered behind the yellow tape, anxious and frightened, breathing heavily as the revelation unfolded in real time. The smell of smoke was in the air, a mixture of adrenaline and tension seeping into the nostrils, making each step of the operation even more dramatic, almost cinematic. Inside the residence, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Police officers searched every room with military precision, overturning furniture, meticulously ripping off doors, and opening secret compartments that revealed hidden layers of a mystery no one had dared imagine. The basement, previously hidden from view, became the epicenter of an operation that already surpassed any known police journalism script. Every movement was heavy, every breath charged with expectation, and every footstep seemed to echo like a somberly rhythmic drumbeat announcing the imminent outcome. Emily, still trembling, was carefully removed from her prison by the firm arms of an officer and led to the ambulance parked in front of the house, while neighbors couldn't contain their emotions, applauding with tears in their eyes, some murmuring prayers, others simply watching, helpless in the face of a mixture of relief and horror that seemed to hang in the air. Cameras captured every detail, transforming what should have been a simple rescue operation into a public, almost ritualistic spectacle that would leave its mark on the town's collective memory. However, the tension wasn't over. While one part of the team tended to Emily, another spread out around the area, searching every corner, every narrow alley, hunting for the man who had held her captive for so long, as if the night itself conspired to test the patience and determination of those seeking justice. The siege was meticulous, precise, and nearly silent. 2 blocks away, a shadow trying to escape through the narrow alleys was finally overtaken, and a police officer's shout of command echoed like a final sentence, followed by the dry, unmistakable sound of handcuffs being locked, which reverberated through the buildings and left the crowd momentarily silent, only to be replaced by boos and insults directed at the criminal, who, blank-eyed and breathing heavily, walked under the weight of collective indignation, unable to hide his face from the revolt that had formed around him. Deshawn watched. From afar, shielded by a police officer trying to pull him away from the commotion, but his eyes never left the residence. Every movement in the basement seemed etched in his mind. Every muffled scream that had led him there lingered like a shadow over his consciousness. He felt neither euphoria nor victory. His expression was a mixture of relief and heaviness, as if the responsibility of having uncovered truths no one ever wanted to see was something that could be diluted, as if carrying the reality of what had happened were a burden destined to stay with him forever. The nearest reporter shouted into the cameras, describing Deshawn as the boy who refused to be silent, while flashbulbs captured his image, transforming him, without him even realizing it, into a symbol of courage, an icon of resistance for the entire city. But inside, he just wished he had never had to walk through that door, that he had never been forced to face the reality that lurked in the darkness, that he had never heard the silent screams that begged for release. As Emily received first aid, doubt hung like a heavy cloud over everyone present. If a child could be hidden there for so long without anyone noticing, how many other secrets, how many other lives could be erased, neglected, hidden behind locked doors and silent walls in forgotten houses across the city? The question had no immediate answer, and the silence became a third character that night, heavy, palpable, filling every space with an almost unbearable tension. The officers, though exhausted, remained vigilant, reviewing records, questioning neighbors, mentally reconstructing every step the criminal took, every blind spot that allowed such horror to happen. Deshawn remained still, feeling the weight of the city on his shoulders, aware that, even with the arrest made and the girl safe, something inside him had changed forever. He had become a witness to human cruelty, and at the same time, a guardian of a courage few understood. And as the night wore on, the helicopter lights reflected off puddles of water scattered throughout the streets, creating distorted, almost ghostly reflections that seemed to magnify the horror of what had happened. The cold wind carried echoes of screams, hurried footsteps and sirens, as the crowd slowly dispersed, taking with it the image of a boy who had defied fear, the house that had held dark secrets, and the question that continued to echo in everyone's hearts: how many other horrors remained hidden, silently waiting to be uncovered? And in that moment, even with Emily finally safe, Deshawn understood that sometimes rescue isn't just physical, not just the release of a body. True rescue is bearing the responsibility of truth, memory, and justice, knowing that as long as there is silence, there will always be shadows lurking, ready to test the courage of those willing to face them. The next morning, the city seemed to breathe differently. The headlines featured Emily's face being carried away by police officers, and next to it, a photo of a boy with a shy, serious look. Deshawn Lewis. The reports narrated how his persistence had uncovered a secret that even the adults didn't want to believe. He, who had been so often ridiculed for his imagination, was now being called a hero on all the local radio and television stations. At school, the atmosphere was different. The hallways, once filled with laughter at his shyness, were now filled with curious and even respectful glances. Some of his classmates, embarrassed, tried to approach him, murmuring words of admiration, but Deshawn remained silent. There was no pride in his expression, only the quiet serenity of someone carrying the weight of having seen what no one else wanted to see. In the neighborhood, people who had previously ignored him began to greet him, offering smiles and pats on the back. Even the police officer who, days before, had laughed at his complaint, approached him. Embarrassed, apologizing for not listening, Angela, his mother, hugged him with tears in her eyes, repeating between sobs that she was proud of him, though she also trembled at the thought of the risk her son had taken alone. A small ceremony was held outside the police station, where officials publicly thanked the boy for his courage. An officer handed him a symbolic medal, but Deshawn held it with trembling hands, unsure of what to do. He wasn't seeking recognition, never medals or headlines. His greatest wish was simple, that someone had believed in him before he had to risk himself like that. And while everyone celebrated his courage, Deshawn remained with his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if there was still something to be discovered. Because, as much as the city vibrated with gratitude, inside him still echoed the nagging feeling that this wasn't the last time he would hear screams coming from a forgotten place. The world seemed to finally listen to him, but would it be prepared to believe him again when the next secret came to light? Back in his room, Deshawn sat on the edge of his bed, holding the medal he'd been given hours earlier. The metal gleamed in the dim light of the lamp, but for him, the memory held no weight of victory. In his eyes, reflected in the window, there was only the silence of someone carrying unanswered questions. Outside, the city seemed to sleep peacefully, but the boy knew the tranquility was fragile, almost illusory, like a curtain about to tear at the next secret. Angela walked past the bedroom door, wished him good night, and turned off the hallway light. The boy responded with only a wave, avoiding words that might betray the uneasiness consuming him. He stood there, motionless, watching the dark neighborhood streets through the window. The wind made the tree branches sway gently, casting restless shadows on the asphalt. Every detail seemed to carry a silent warning, as if the world around him were trying to whisper something no one else dared to hear. For a moment, Deshawn closed his eyes, trying to convince himself it was all over. Emily was safe, the criminal had been caught, and his town finally believed in him. However, a single distant sound shattered the illusion. A muffled noise coming from a nearby street reached his ears like a dark echo. It wasn't the wind, nor a car engine, but something subtler, almost human. He stood up slowly, still holding the flashlight he'd brought that fateful night on his bedside table. His fingers touched it with the hesitation of someone grasping an uncomfortable truth. And as he glanced out the window again, his breath caught for a second. At the end of the street, in the shadows, there seemed to be a strange movement. A swift figure disappeared behind a fence, leaving only the question of what had actually been seen. Deshawn's heart raced. He knew deep down that this wasn't the end. What had happened to Emily was just a fragment of an even larger reality, and ignoring the signs would never be an option again. And it is in this unsettling silence that the inevitable question remains. How far can a boy's courage go when the city's secrets come to light again? If you want to follow each new mystery and not miss the next stories of courage and suspense, subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell, and share this video. Your participation is what keeps these stories alive that need to be told.